Hello, Richard Tang, CEO of Zen Internet, here for another interview. Now, they said in the gold rush that the people that made the real money were the people that sold the shovels. And if you're a network builder in the UK, then more than likely you're going to be using kit from Adtran. And here today, I've got with me the Chief Technology Officer for Europe, Middle East and Africa of Adtran, Ronan Kelly. Very warm welcome, Ronan.
Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, start off, I've just done an analogy with shovels and the gold rush, but what do Adtran actually do, and why is it the majority of network builders need to use your kit?
Well, building out this new infrastructure, doing that migration from the copper access networks that have served for the last 100 years over to the fibre infrastructure that's going to serve us for the next 100 years. It's all well and good building out the fibre, but unless you can shine light down that fibre and deliver data over it, it's of limited use. So what Adtran do is we provide equipment that basically translates data into the light pulses that will take you from the core of the internet at the data center interconnect points right through the access networks and into the customer's home. And then ultimately we break that out into the Wi-Fi signal that allows users to tap into that data signal with the equipment that they use on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, let's talk about the markets and the UK. I mean, you've got a great insight of the full fibre market in the UK
Sure.
versus Europe, maybe the Middle East and Africa as well, but particularly Europe. You know, it's the UK sometimes gets a bit of slating for being behind the times, but is that really the case?
Well, if we roll back the clock 6-7 years ago, it was absolutely the case. The UK was right there with Germany as amongst the laggards within Europe. But getting started late proved to be quite fortuitous for the UK, because what happened was, with the emergence of the altnet community, the private equity firms that were getting behind the altnet community, a lot of this was born out of, particularly low interest rates in the market. In many scenarios, a lot of the traditional investment safe havens had gone negative on their returns. So fibre looked like a very attractive investment for many of those institutions. And as a result of that capital being made available, there was a new technology that was just emerging on the market at that point in time. This is around 2016 within the ITU, which is the body that standardizes the fibre to the home technologies. They had just released XGS-PON. And most of the operators, the challenger operators in the UK market, were very quick to grab onto that. They looked at it through the lens of, I'm building this new fibre infrastructure, I'm building it to last for the next 100 years. The technology that was available in the marketplace at that point in time was GPON technology, a fantastic technology, but it was already 12 years old at that point in time. So many of the operators saw this opportunity to embrace something that was brand new, that would quadruple the capacity of the original GPON networks in the downstream direction and would have an 8-fold increase in capacity in the upstream direction. And he said, this is it. This is the holy grail. I've got a nice new shiny network. I've got state-of-the-art technology. This is going to allow me to stand out from the competitors out there. And what we've seen now as a result, and this is why I wanted to roll the clock back a little bit just to set the scene of where we've come from. Because if we look at where the UK now stands amongst its peers in the European market, I would argue the UK is the most advanced fibre to the home market now, not just in Europe, but I would include in the Western world now at this point in time, because the vast majority have already built out with XGS-PON technology for their customers. And for those that started traditionally, the larger operators who are more cost sensitive, they would have started out with GPON. They've also now embraced XGS-PON as well. So I would say 99, if not 100% of the operators in the UK market today are able to offer services using that XGS-PON technology, which if we compare that to markets that are perhaps further along with their fibre build-outs, in markets like Spain, Portugal, Italy, etc., where they started much earlier, they started all with GPON, and now they're coming to the point where they're at this upgrade cycle point where they've got to now make a fresh investment and upgrade all the electronics on the end of the fibre so that they can embrace that XGS-PON capability and really move into the multi-gig society that the UK already is.
And so just from a technical point of view, the difference between GPON, XGS-PON, GPON is gigabit passive optical network.
Yep.
XGS-PON, I've no idea what that stands for.
So the X stands for 10, the S stands for symmetric, the G stands for gigabit, and PON is passive optical network, just like in GPON. So it's 10 gig symmetric capacity, versus with GPON, you have 2.5 gig down,
Yep.
and 1.25 gig up. And then typically you're going to share that between either 32 or 64, in some extreme cases, 128 customers.
Yeah. And XGS-PON Is that not shared at all?
No, it's also shared, but you've got more capacity to share amongst those users. So what we tend to see here in the UK, the bulk of the operators in the UK deploy a 1:32 sharing ratio, or split ratio as we call it in the market. But what we've seen is a lot of innovative operators have also started out at the very beginning with a 1:128 way split ratio. So they can put a lot of subscribers onto each XGS-PON port, but they've been clever in how they've done that. So in a PON network where I've got a single fibre coming through, and then I pass that light from that fibre through what we call a splitter. It's a passive, it's a piece of glass, if you will, that sits in the network and shares that light amongst the 32 connections off the end. What we've seen is with some of the innovative operators, at the central location where the light begins, they've located a 1:4 split. And then off the end of that, then they have a 1:32 split off each of those 4 connections. So that brings it up to a total of 1:128. But what it allows for later is, in time, when the traffic levels grow on the networks, if they start to approach a congestion point, they can remove that first stage 1:4 split and give each of the 1:32 splits out in the field their own dedicated port. So now all of a sudden they're back to a 1:32 split. So it lowers the congestion. It means they can extract much, much longer out of the equipment, but also their upfront investment at the beginning is kept to a minimum, and their power consumption, which is really important these days, is also kept to a minimum as well.
So a lot of the newer altnets have gone straight to XGS-PON. I know that OpenReach, who are the biggest fibre builder in the UK currently, have got quite a lot of GPON in their network, but they're deploying XGS-PON. I mean, what are your insights into what OpenReach are doing? Are you a supplier to OpenReach?
We are indeed. We're very fortunate to be working with OpenReach as part of the fibre to the home build out that they're doing. With the larger operators, and we see this on a global basis, when you're servicing millions of households, and like we know OpenReach's target is 25 million households, every pound extra that a piece of equipment that goes on a customer prem, every pound extra that costs is times 25 million. So you've got to be exceptionally cost sensitive, and you've got that difficult job of navigating when to introduce the next technology. At what point does the current technology prove to be an impediment to your ability to grow? And I think OpenReach have navigated that particularly well from the point of view they've continued to utilize GPON and will do for many, many years. But what they're looking at is what we call within Adtran combo PON technology. Now, this is not a new technology per se. It's basically a miniaturization, if you will, where in the optical component, what we call the transceiver that connects onto the fiber networks, we've been able to pack in both GPON and XGS-PON components into that single optical component, including the optical combiner that sits within that component. So now, very cost effectively, operators like OpenReach and many of the altnets that are using the same combo PON technology can deliver both GPON and XGS-PON at the exact same time across those individual fiber strands. And then out the other end at the customer premise, if they feel it's going to be a heavy user that they need to deliver multi-gig services, they just plug in an XGS-PON CPE equipment, what we call an ONT, an optical network terminal. Or if it's going to be a light user, someone ordering 100 meg, for example, they can tap into that lower cost structure and just plug in a GPON ONT. And other than that, it's transparent. It's a very, very simple way of introducing it. So they've been quite astute in the migration path that they've selected. And as they go forward now, they've got that flexibility that they can continue to exploit the very low cost structure, the very well matured cost structure that goes with GPON. But then as the network starts to load up on the GPON wavelength, they have XGS-PON as an escape valve, if you will, to take those heavier users off and migrate them onto XGS-PON, freeing up all that capacity so that the GPON users can continue to use it for decades to come.
Yeah. In terms of Adtran itself, I understand that your kit is in about 2/3 of UK altnets.
Correct.
So what is it? What is so special about your kit that you've managed to build actually very quickly a dominant market share from, I think, what you said 8 years ago, you went from 0, now you've got 2/3 of the market. There must be something special that you're doing.
Adtran is from the
And
beginning.
how can Zen get 2/3 of the broadband market? Maybe I can pick up some tips.
Well, definitely. So Adtran from the beginning, when we really started to focus in on the UK market, we were already doing some copper service delivery. We were involved in projects like Swan in Scotland and stuff like that for SHDSL delivery. And we were looking at what was starting to bubble up as this emerging focus on fibre to the home. We could see legislation in Europe around the European Electronic Communications Code was making its way to the fore. There was new government targets being set with regard to delivery. Initially, it was focused on gigabit service rates, and then it kind of refined down to full fibre connectivity. So we could see that playing in the backdrop of at the macro level, and we were saying to ourselves, there is going to be this migration coming, and it's going to come over the next decade or so. How do we make sure Adtran can capture market share? And we made a few, I'll call it failed entrance attempts in the beginning, where we tried to come along with what I'd describe as the Me Too technology. So at the time, there was probably 2% of UK homes passed with full fibre, and they were passed with either point-to-point Ethernet technology, or they were passed with GPON technology. And we felt point-to-point Ethernet technology, it was an interesting technology, but it wasn't the right way to go from an efficiency point of view. That PON was absolutely the right thing to get behind from a utilization of resources, rack space, electricity, etc., and also the cost structure. When we tried to break into the market using GPON, what we found was the incumbent vendors that had already established footprint, they just dialed down the price to keep us out. And, I'd do the exact same thing if I was in their shoes. So we said, right, this isn't the right approach. We really need to come along with something disruptive. So around that time frame, this is around 2015 time frame, in May of 2015, I was asked by Adtran to go over and make a representation to FSAN. So FSAN is kind of the operator-led pre-standardization body that feeds into the ITU. The ITU is the body that set the standards for technologies like GPON, etc. And at the time within the marketplace, we had GPON, which we felt was going to start to come under some pressure with regard to utilization levels on the technology a couple of years down the road. We had another technology called NG-PON2, which was a multi-wavelength 8 by 10 gig technology, really, really fabulous technology. But the problem was horrendously expensive. And we recognized that that wasn't going to be the answer for growth in the consumer space. So I was asked to go in and make a representation to FSAN for the need for a fixed wavelength, so a non-multi-wavelength, non-tunable wavelength, a fixed wavelength 10 gig symmetric PON technology. And as part of my assertion, there was lots of PON technologies in the industry at that point in time, and it was very confusing. So I said, look, we need a fixed wavelength 10 gig symmetric PON technology, but let's not add to the PON soup as we described it by calling it something else, another new acronym. Let's just call it NG-PON2 fixed. So because NG-PON2 was tunable, let's call it NG-PON2 fixed. So we won the first assertion, and they said, yes, you're right, we agree, and we're going to lobby now the ITU to rapidly standardize a 10 gig symmetric PON technology. We lost the second battle, and what came out was the name of XGS-PON as a result of that. So that was at the end of 2015. The ITU had pushed out the XGS-PON, the brand new standard. In January 2016, Adtran went live with its first UK customer using XGS-PON technology, a small little outfit at the time called Callflow. They're now Truly. And they went live. And at the time, it was with some very expensive equipment, low port density. I'd call it enterprise-grade CPE that was being deployed in the consumer space. But we knew that this was going to come down the cost curve very quickly as soon as volume started to ramp up. So we got behind Callflow, and quickly we got other early adopters like Community Fibre. Jeremy Shallow was heading them up at the time, so he saw the opportunity there and said, yeah, I want to do this too. And we got a lot of early adopters. We started to build momentum very, very quickly. In the meantime, we had our engineering teams very heavily focused on driving the cost out of the XGS-PON solution, where it never quite got down to GPON levels, but the differential, if you look at a fibre to the home connected cost, the electronics are about 15% of the end-to-end connection. So the uplift that they had to pay in the scheme of things was actually quite small. So a lot of the altnets were looking at this going, hang on, I'm about to embark on spending tens, if not hundreds of millions, building out this fibre infrastructure, and there's this new technology that in the overall cost of connecting my customer is going to add a percentage or two. This was a no-brainer for them. And we knew the incumbent vendors at the time would be slow to react because their view was, I'm already dominant with GPON in the marketplace. XGS-PON is my payday. That's when I get my big upgrade cycle and I get to charge premium margins for that. So they were never going to rush into being a cost leader in the XGS-PON space. Roll the clock forward 7 years, and as you say, 2/3 of the market sits with Adtran, including all the big operators in the UK market. And we've taken that model, we've replicated in Germany, for example. So in Germany today, 1/3 of German households connect to the internet through Adtran equipment today. So we're replicating it across Europe. We're focused on Italy now as well. So, it's worked well for us.
Yeah, fantastic. How important was the merger or the joining with ADVA in that?
It's relatively new, and the market is still digesting the combination of the two companies. So what ADVA, if we look at Adtran, US-based organization, is coming up on its 40th year now of operations, has been actively focused on the European market for the last 20 years or so and growing its market share, but has always been focused on the access side of the business. Now, whether it was for consumer services or enterprise services, but predominantly focused on that access side of the business. ADVA brought to the table a whole transport portfolio that took us from the access nodes across the metro network into the data centers where all the internet peering, etc. happens. Very competitive data center interconnect portfolio. And then there was elements of access within the ADVA portfolio as well that were focused towards the enterprise side of things. So for example, if you take an EAD service here in the UK today, that's delivered on ADVA end-to-end equipment. So now what we're starting to do within the portfolio is combine the elements where it makes sense to combine them. So for example, there's elements of the traditional Adtran fibre access portfolio that are now making their way into things like the carrier Ethernet services that are delivered as part of EAD. Equally, what we have is some of the solutions like the fibre monitoring solutions. We're now embedding intelligence from the Adtran fibre access platforms, what we call the OLT platforms, and combining that intelligence with the fibre monitoring to give much greater visibility and a much lower cost structure so that fibre monitoring can now be applied across the PON networks, where historically it was prohibitive to do that. So it's that cross-pollination of capability, that cross-pollination of engineering now is slowly but surely making its way out to the customers. And obviously the focus is to bring everything in underneath the one umbrella of management and orchestration so that the customers can enjoy the benefits of going from the core all the way through the door to the Wi-Fi handoff point within the home under one management orchestration solution.
Let's talk about the future of full fibre in the UK, a topic of much speculation
Absolutely.
at the moment. I coined the term goldrush to describe it a couple of years ago now. Yeah. But I think that the term that probably better describes it in my mind now is Wacky Races. You remember the Wacky Races?
I do indeed. Penelope Pitstop. And
that Dick Dastardly and all that lot. Yeah. Because, of course, OpenReach are charging ahead. You've got about 100 altnets of varying sizes all charging ahead with their build.
Yeah.
But then the interest rates have gone up and the altnets are really feeling the pinch. All the altnets that I've spoken to have talked about this big consolidation that is imminently going to happen or going to happen over the next few years. But I mean, where do you see it and all settling and ending up in the UK? And is there anything from Europe that sort of gives you some insight into where the UK will end up in, say, 5 years' time when it's all happened?
Yeah.
And, Penelope's pit stop is the winner or the second or the third place.
Look, without question, the landscape has changed. It was always going to change. It has become more pronounced with rising interest rates. The only thing I will say on that side of things is that's starting to soften now. So if we look at inflation levels, like interest rates have gone up because inflation levels have gone up. Inflation levels are now starting to soften. If you look at any of the news reports coming out from UK, Europe, US, they're all starting to soften, and we're starting to see a little bit of a softening on the interest rates as well. So hopefully that will start to normalize and it'll ease some of the pressure. And more importantly, keep the investor focused towards the fibre infrastructure. Because remember, why did the investors get into the fibre infrastructure in the first place? Because their traditional safe havens were not available to them. They weren't delivering returns, or it was negative returns at best. So that concentrated a lot of money in the direction of building fibre networks. Many of them are sufficiently far down the path that they kind of need to stay in the game, which is a good thing because we want them to stay in the game. But you're absolutely right. Some of the business models some of the weaknesses in some of the business models have been exposed now by the rise in costs, by the rise in interest rates, by the scarcity of capital as well. So, any weakness that's there, I think ultimately is going to result in consolidation occurring. There is a mixed bag in there in the UK with regard to the operators' long-term intents. What were the exit strategies? There are many of these networks that have been built to be sold in the first place. That was the original plan. No aspiration to become a long-term service provider. I want to build this, get a number of subscribers on the network, get a certain homes pass figure, and then flip it. And this time next year we'll be millionaires, to quote Rodney and Del Boy. Yeah. But there are a lot, and particularly those that are serving geographic focused areas that were underserved, that they have aspirations to go the long run. They want to build up a community of customers that stay loyal to them, and they want to grow that business, reasonably well. It will be interesting to see what way that plays out. I sometimes joke and say we've seen this movie before. It was called the UK cable industry. And, the UK cable industry was very, very similar, highly fractured in the beginning. Ultimately, it made its way down to one. I don't believe that will happen. I don't believe Ofcom will allow that to happen because there's a need for competition within the marketplace. Any market where you've zero competition, particularly infrastructure-based competition, results in consumer getting squeezed on price. So I believe when I've been asked about this, I've always said I think we're going to end up with roughly about 5. And that will be, Openreach is going nowhere. Let's be frank about it, okay? Virgin Media likely going nowhere as well. So you've got 2 there. You have City Fibre also. Now, whether that remains the name above the door, who knows? But the infrastructure that they're building in the long term, that's going nowhere as well. You're going to have some regionally focused service providers. So if we look at the likes of GigaClear, for example, or even operators that are dealing with the really hard to serve locations, Lothian Broadband, etc., these are locations that are just simply too expensive for others to follow through as a second provider. So I think we'll end up with a small handful of regional players that have their corner of the market well served, too expensive to displace them, and they'll continue to operate. I don't want to call it a lifestyle business because that's disparaging to the size, but if you know what I mean, there'll be a medium-size operator that will service that geographic area and offer wholesale services then to the retail brands that want to get in there.
Will those smaller regional operators, or even the rural and local operators, will they be able to survive, do you think? I mean, right now they can because they're the only game in town for full fibre in a lot of these places.
Yep.
But Openreach is very clear that they're going to overbuild everyone pretty much. VMO2 are going to do something similar.
Sure.
And I do sort of feel like whereas the big networks will survive and will consolidate like the cable companies to a 1 or 2 bigger organisations, for the ones that want to go it alone in the long term that then get overbuilt, I'm just thinking that the economics of that initial 20-year business model, when they might have assumed that they'll get up to a third of people signing up to them, well, when they're competing with all the ISPs that are on Openreach or with VMOT as well,
Yep.
they might stop in single digits. That business model might never pay.
Yeah, and this is the challenge. So we spoke about this just before we started recording with regard to the importance of making sure that the quality of the service that you deliver to the consumer is exceptional. And with the medium that these operators are building, there's no reason why it shouldn't be. Fibre as a medium for delivering data is very, very robust. So as long as the core networks that they're designing to deliver that data service are equally robust, but most importantly, I think the biggest challenge the industry faces now is as the capacity that fibre delivers has become available, and as we've seen the service rates go beyond 100 meg onwards to 200, 500 gig, all of the weaknesses that existed for many, many years in the Wi-Fi infrastructures within the home has now been exposed. They were always there, but when you had 30 meg, you didn't see them. When you had 10 devices on the network, you didn't see them. But now consumers are edging their way up to 30 devices on average per household. They're getting multiple hundreds of megabits per second, if not gigabits per second, and all of a sudden it's not performing. And part of the reason it's not performing is the Wi-Fi infrastructure that they have hasn't been up to the task. So the operators really need to be very, very careful to make sure that they focus on the service that they're delivering. And a part of that service is the endpoint, the Wi-Fi experience for that consumer. And if they get that bit right, well then when other people come knocking, you do have that switching risk that will sit in the consumer's mind to say, well, actually, I get my service from Zen. It just works. It's like when I turn on the lights come on. When I turn on the tap, the water comes out. I don't have to concern myself about how many gigabits it is and blah, blah, blah. So I think the opportunity that exists between now and when OpenReach is ubiquitous, or when Virgin Media is ubiquitous, is garnering that customer loyalty, garnering that satisfaction, building brand reputation in the areas that they're servicing, getting the communities behind them. And then they have a reasonable chance. But I think if they don't focus on that from the very beginning, then it's going to be a real challenge. Because as you say, brand equity is really, really important, and you're going to get some very well-known and very well-trusted brands coming through the door. They're going to have bundled offerings. You know, you can get your mobile, you can get your TV, you can get your broadband, and that's going to be compelling to a lot of users, particularly if they're not satisfied with the service they get.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on Wi-Fi. I mean, we've seen that as every year goes on, the amount of time that we spend talking to customers about Wi-Fi and what's happening in the home goes up and up and up.
Absolutely.
So absolutely a big focus of our service.
And there's a balancing act to be had there, because again, it's very easy for us to get caught in the arms race mentality. You know, we see it in the PON world today, right? So I mentioned earlier, UK is probably the most advanced fibre to the home market in the developed world at this point in time. And what we see is there's already a big notional push by some of the vendors in the industry here in the UK. Oh, we've got to move on to the next generation PON. I'm sort of looking at it going, really? Really, we've only just got started with this one and we're ahead of the world. Why do we have to change tomorrow? We're seeing the same thing now in Wi-Fi as well. So where we moved from Wi-Fi 4 and 5 onto 6 is a very capable technology, particularly for gigabit service delivery. You've got 6E for delivery in the high density areas where you've got, you know, a lot of interference or a lot of congestion in the 5 gigahertz space. So if you're doing meshing over the wireless, it can help deal with that. But we see a lot of the conversation going, we have to move to 7. Everybody has to get onto 7 tomorrow. And I'm going, okay, for lead users, fair enough. But for the bulk of the marketplace, come on, can we take a reality check with this stuff? And this is where the service providers have to be very careful, is capital is harder to raise now. It's a lot more scarce. We've got to be frugal in how we spend it. There are a lot of exceptionally good solutions out there today that deliver really good value and deliver the quality of experience that consumers are demanding without having to put the Rolls Royce on the table. And I think we've just got to be careful that we get the balance right between what's actually needed versus the new shiny thing that's coming over the hill.
Completely agree. Completely. Let's talk about Moore's law. Gordon Moore, one of the co-founders of Intel, back in the 70s said the number of transistors on a chip would double every 2 years. After saying 10 years before, it would be every year. And I think, you know, Moore's law has been used more generally to talk about exponential growth in technology, not just number of transistors on a chip, but storage, memory, and of course bandwidth on the internet. And we've seen bandwidth increase exponentially ever since we opened our doors in October 1995. And so I'd be interested to hear of your thoughts for the future of that exponential growth. Is that going to happen without limit in the future? And what does that mean for the future of PON? Obviously, XGS-PON now, completely agree with you. It's more than, you know, actually more than enough bandwidth for anyone. But there will come a time,
of course,
we'll continue to see exponential growth where that starts to be constrained. And so, you know, is there a standard beyond that? Are Adtran doing anything about it? Or is it all XGS-PON? And I suppose back to the question of, can we look forward to exponential growth in bandwidth for the rest of time?
So there's a lot in that. So let me try and unpack.
That's a big question.
Let me try and unpack that piece by piece. All right, so let's talk about what's next, okay? From a standards point of view, within the ITU, there's a standard called G.HSP, and G.HSP is the 50 gig PON standard. Now, originally when G.HSP was brought to market, it was pitched as an asymmetric technology, so it was 50 gig down, 25 gig up. They've since brought out some adaptations to the standard, and that now brings 50 gig to being a symmetric technology. Also, originally when it was brought out, it supported what we call two-way coexistence. So 50 gig PON on the same PON tree could coexist with either GPON or XGS-PON, but not both at the same time. So today we've got combo PON, and that has GPON and XGS-PON on the same network at the same time. ITU recognized the challenge that was going to present, because at some point in the future, if an operator wanted to introduce 50 gig PON onto those PON trees, they would have to vacate most likely GPON and move all those customers onto XGS-PON to facilitate the introduction of 50 gig PON. Thankfully, they've now adapted the standard so it supports three-way combo on the same ODN, so the coexistence of GPON, XGS-PON and 50 gig PON at the exact same time. So that's really nice for the service providers because it means there's no migration pain for them. They can plan for the future and say, right, I'm going to use GPON for my light users, XGS-PON for my mid to heavy users, and in the future I'll introduce 50 gig PON then at a point where it's economically viable to do that. With regard to the growth rates, so we've tracked this within Adtran. We have a team, the staff scientist team, that pull from many, many different sources. And they have settled, they've been doing this for probably 12, 13 years now at this point in time, and they've settled as their safe figure of 25% compound annual growth rate with regard to the usage on the networks. I personally also track data. There's an organization called OpenVault, and OpenVault tracks the average data consumption of users, mainly focused on the North American market, but the figures are not too different to the European market. And I've been tracking their data since 2019. And one of the things that I noticed, and I presented this at the Inca conference there 2 weeks ago, I think it was, where if you look, allowing for seasonality, so the reason seasonality is important is Q4 is always the busiest quarter every single year. And that's because little Johnny and little Jane get the new Xbox and they have to download everything and blah, blah, blah. It drives up the figures. Q1 is the next busiest because you're getting the tail end of that Q4 surge. And then you have Q2 and 3 then are the more normal quarters. But what I've seen is when you allow for seasonality, if you track the year-on-year growth over that extended period of time, the year-on-year growth rate is actually slowing. So where it was, if you picture coming out the tail end of COVID, where everybody had signed up for their Netflix subscriptions, we'd all bought our smart TVs, we'd got our new games consoles to keep ourselves entertained while we were at home. And year-on-year growth rates are up at like 40% or something like that. It's now down below 10%. It's about 9%. So it is starting to soften. When you look at things like the subscription-based video on demand subscription rates, they've also peaked. So what we saw was kind of late 2021, early 2020 was peak for video on demand subscriptions, and now they're starting to soften. Now they're not going to fall off a cliff. You know, over the top is the delivery mechanism for the future. Period. Everything that can be delivered over the top will be. I've said that for a long, long time. But what we have seen is, I think we've seen peak rate on that now with the current technology. So that mix of HD and 4K that represents the household base that's there in the UK, I think we've seen the peak for the moment. Are there going to be things that are going to move the needle as we go further forward? When I talk to industry about this, everybody gravitates towards AR and VR. Oh, that's going to shift it, blah, blah. And I did a lot of modeling. There's a company, a Finnish company called Varjo, VARJO. And Varjo is the pinnacle of AR and VR technology at this point in time. They're not focused towards consumer. They're only focused towards large enterprise and government applications. Their headsets come in at about $10,000 a piece. And their focus is to replicate the 12K resolution that you're looking at me at now, which is what the human eye sees in. And they can do it. They can replicate that. When you model 12K resolution at 120 hertz, and with, I'm trying to remember the numbers because I did this ages ago, 360 degree field of view, and I think it was 120 degree vertical. Basically you end up at like 960 megabits per second per headset, okay? Which is a lot, it will move the needle. But the thing is, that technology at the moment has a long way to go before it gets democratized. It has to come down the cost curve significantly before we can replicate that in the consumer space. But even when we can replicate it in the consumer space, I've always argued AR and VR are what I call an occasional technology. They're the sort of thing you'll use for a purpose, for an interaction, whether you're learning through training, whether it's a family call, you know, a video call type thing. This vision that people are going to walk around with AR and VR headsets all day, every day, I just don't buy into it. I'm sorry. I don't see it as being pragmatic until miniaturization gets to the point that I can fit it into a pair of normal eyeglasses, and that's some ways away. I think, you know, we'll all be well retired before we start to see that capability. So what else is going to move the needle? We've felt the impact of over-the-top TV. We've felt the impact of 4K. So we know where the data rates are at. We're seeing the data rates starting to soften now, the year-on-year growth rate starting to soften. So the things I would be keeping an eye on is, I discovered this recently. My son, Elliot, it was last year. He and I were in the house. I had just taken delivery of some of the new Adtran Wi-Fi gateways, and I was playing around with the capabilities. And one of the capabilities, I had this kind of real-time, it was updating every 2 or 3 seconds graph of what was going on the network. And it was Elliot and I in the house, and I wasn't doing anything, but yet there was 20 megabit a second going across the network. And I knew he was on his Xbox upstairs, and I shouted up, "Elliot, what are you up to?" "Gaming, why?" Usual teenage grunts, And I says, "What are you playing?" Out of curiosity. "I'm on Flight Sim, why?" And I said, "Okay, this is interesting." So we had seen the evolution in the gaming industry, just like where we had seen with music distribution and video distribution, where we'd gone from physical medium on the high street to one-time download, where you'd store it locally at home, to streaming. We had seen the gaming industry attempt to get into streaming with the likes of Stadia and stuff like that, and it hasn't materialized fully just yet. I'm convinced it's not gone away, but for the moment, it's parked. But Elliot was playing this on his Xbox. He was playing Microsoft Flight Sim on his Xbox, and it was sucking down 20 megaseconds. I'm going, what's going on here? So with a little bit of investigation, what I came to realize was Flight Sim, it was a little bit of a canary in the coal mine for the direction of the gaming industry. Because while they'd given up on streaming, pure streaming, in the near term, what they now had was this hybrid model that was being demonstrated in Flight Sim, where you could download Flight Sim, and I think it was like 120 gig or 160 gig, whatever it was big, and that would install locally on your Xbox. But what that got you was the cockpit controls, the layout, the reactions to your movements, and so on and so forth. What it didn't get you was the 2.4 petabytes of scenery when you looked out the window and flew over your house going, "Oh, look, there's my house, there's my school, blah, blah, blah." It didn't get you that stuff. That was streamed to you.
Right.
And I was thinking this through going, wow, okay, that's impressive. So when I looked, first of all, at the fidelity of the graphics of that, they were great, they were novel, but they're very vectorized graphics. If we're frank about it, they're a bit crap. You can just about make out the shape of your house and go, "Oh, there's my house." But think about where that could go to. If that could go to HD and then onwards to 4K, streaming on a real-time basis into that gaming environment, what impact that would have on the data rates as we're playing those games. The other thing I started to think about was, what other games could that impact? And I started to think about games like Fortnite. And it's funny, there's a whole renaissance going on with Fortnite right now at this moment in time, where, it was, top of the charts there a couple of years ago, and then suddenly kind of the novelty factor fell off a cliff. Now all of a sudden it's back up the top again. Seemingly they brought back out the original maps and everybody loves it again. So, but if you look at Fortnite has a restricted playing area. It's about 5 square kilometers thereabouts that people can run around and shoot each other. And I was sort of saying to myself, and the graphical environment, while it's novel, it's very cartoonish, it's quite basic. And I was saying to myself, well, what if I could take Fortnite and plonk it in the middle of New York City and have 4K resolution and limitless with regard to the boundaries, have that all streamed to me on a real-time basis? What would be the impact of that? So that to me is the area I'm looking at for growth now, is, what's going on in the gaming sector that's going to drive A, an increase in the fidelity, and B, an expanded playing area for the games like the first-person shooters, etc. That it becomes an unlimited environment, just like Flight Sim is. I can fly to any part of the world today, maybe not North Korea, but you know what I mean, any part of the world today, and get that basic graphic view of what's on the ground there. In time, the fidelity of that will increase, and I think we can expect that to spill over into games like first-person shooters, etc.
Yeah, interesting. We had lunch with some colleagues in the Zen restaurant earlier, and the subject of discussion was Fortnite. Kids
absolutely
beating each other up in Fortnite.
I think it's hilarious. Like my sister, when it first came out, she was really concerned about my nephew Killian. "Oh, Killian, you're spending way too much time on that, blah, blah, blah." And as I explained to my sister, I said, "Lavina," I said, "do you remember when you used to finish school every day, and 2 doors down, her friend Rachel's parents both worked, so they used to have a free house every day, and you go and hang in Rachel's kitchen." I said, "This is the new version of Rachel's kitchen. It's a hangout. It's where they hang out with each other. They sneak up behind each other and shoot each other in the backside. That's what they do. It's a fun playground. That's all it is. And they're not dependent on good weather."
Yeah, well, absolutely. Last question, looking at your website, Adtran is also already thinking of the future in terms of the ability of quantum computers to crack cryptography.
Sure.
And building in quantum resistant cryptography. So just tell us a bit about that. That'd be
absolutely
a way to finish off.
So as part of the combination of ADVA and Adtran, one of the sets of capabilities that came across was within the ADVA organization, we had a team that was originally focused on developing the ability to take quantum generated keys and apply them to the encryption running across the network. And the team have developed the capability with the leading quantum key generation systems that they're able to take that on an automated basis and apply that to the endpoints on the network. And that can be done at the factory at load. So it means the keys are never transmitted individually themselves. So you've got a physically secure network. And the thought process behind that is there are a lot of government agencies, there's a lot of military agencies, etc., that they need to have a scenario where you've got a rapidly evolving encryption environment so that if data does get pre-recorded, or recorded, I should say, with a view to decrypting it later when quantum compute is sufficiently available and robust enough that it can be applied on decrypting data, which is one of the ideal workloads that a quantum computer can deal with, that you've got a scenario where you've got quantum keys changing that rapidly across that system that that data, even if it's pre-recorded, simply cannot be hacked. It would take too long to hack it. So that's been part of what came over with the ADVA combination with Adtran. Now, because it's got a lot of government customers, a lot of military customers, one of the conditions of sale of the Adtran business, the combination of the Adtran business with ADVA, was that that capability would be spun out as a separate legal entity. It's still a wholly owned subsidiary, and that's been spun out under ADVA Network Security, so ANS as we call it internally. So you'll recognize the A from the Adtran in the logo of it, but it's a standalone entity as part of that. And the real focus for that organization is to deliver the most secure network connections that are possible, but on a real-time rate. When you start talking about encryption, you need to be able to do it on your 100 gig, your 400 gig, your 1.6 terabit per second optical connections at the optical layer on a real-time basis without introducing latency. And that's the focus for the team there.
Yeah. So I think what we're saying is, as and when quantum computers get real,
Yep.
I mean, I suppose,
Democratized,
commercialized.
yeah, commercialized is probably a better phrase, yeah.
And I guess they get the noise levels down so
Exactly.
that they're precise enough, and hackers get hold of them and try and hack into Adtran kit.
They'll have their work cut out for them.
Yeah, they're not going to
Exactly.
get anywhere. So we
And this is
can all be
critical.
safe at home with our Fortnite,
Exactly.
shooting our friends up.
Indeed. And this is critical that we stay ahead of that curve, because that technology will make its way into different hands. And we all know there's good and bad actors in society. And not all of them are, individuals. Not all of them are corporate entities. Some of them are governments.
Yeah. Fantastic. Ronan, it's been absolutely a pleasure. Thank you very much for joining me. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching.